Welcome to Learning English, a daily 30-minute program from the Voice of America. I'm Jonathan Evans.
And I'm Ashley Thompson. This program is aimed at English learners, so we speak a little slower and we use words and phrases especially written for people learning English.
Today on the program, you will hear from Alice Bryant and Anna Mateo. Later, Steve Ember will present our American history series, The Making of a Nation. But first, Mexico has begun taking steps to increase security near its border with the United States. Mexican officials announced Sunday that police arrested 39 people after a peaceful march turned violent. The march was called to protest long processing delays for immigrants seeking asylum in the United States. The violence began when a group of migrants broke away from the protesters and attempted to cross the border. U.S. border agents reacted by firing tear gas into Mexico. U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Kristen Nielsen said Customs and Border Patrol agents were struck by objects thrown by members of the group. The agency said that officers decided to use the tear gas because of the risk to agents' safety. Mexico's Interior Ministry said that officials were able to contain a group of about 500 people who violently tried to cross the border. The ministry said that those found to have taken part in the violence would be expelled immediately. About 5,000 Central American migrants have been staying at a sports center in Tijuana for more than a week. Many are from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Most say they are trying to escape poverty and violence in their homelands. After the violence, Levin Sarmiento of Honduras walked back to the sports center with her 4-year-old daughter. Sarmiento said she had been near the bottom of the Tijuana River when U.S. agents fired tear gas. She told the Associated Press, "We ran, but the smoke always reached us and my daughter was choking." She said she never would have gotten that close with her daughter if she thought there would be tear gas. The wind carried some of the gas toward hundreds of migrants after some tried to get through the wire and fencing separating the two countries. U.S. officials closed the border crossing at San Isidro for several hours at the end of last week. On Friday, Tijuana Mayor Juan Manuel Gastelum declared a humanitarian crisis in his city, which is home to 1.6 million people. He said that Tijuana is struggling to shelter the large number of migrants. Irineo Mujica has traveled with the migrants for weeks as a representative of the aid group Pueblos Sin Fronteras. He said the aim of Sunday's march was to make the migrants' suffering more visible to U.S. and Mexican officials. "We can't have all these people here," he said.
A new U.S. government report says climate change is affecting the United States. It warns that the danger of destructive weather events, from powerful storms to extremely dry weather and wildfires is worsening. Some findings are in conflict with the statements and policies of President Donald Trump. The report, called the Fourth National Climate Assessment, was released on November 23rd. It was written long before the deadly fires in California this month and before Hurricanes Florence and Michael struck the East Coast. The report noted that U.S. records for destructive weather have been set in recent years. Weather-related damage has cost nearly $400 billion since 2015, the Associated Press reported. The climate assessment is required by law every few years. It was based on more than 1,000 earlier research studies. More than 300 researchers in 13 U.S. government offices and agencies prepared the report. It explains how the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas is affecting different areas of the country and how this affects the U.S. economy, including energy and agriculture. The report noted that temperatures in the lower 48 states have risen 1 degree Celsius since the year 1900. By the end of the 21st century, the country will be 1.6 to 6.6 degrees higher, depending on how much pollution is released into the atmosphere. Studies have linked the temperature increase to carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The climate assessment warned of longer and more powerful disasters resulting, at least in part, from rising temperatures. It said weather disasters are becoming more commonplace and warned that without aggressive action, they could become much worse. The report avoids proposing policy changes, but it said that people must take steps to stop further weather disasters to avoid substantial damages to the U.S. economy, environment, and human health and well-being over the coming decades. Future risks from climate change depend primarily on decisions made today, the report said. The Trump administration is downplaying the importance of the findings. It says the report was largely based on the most extreme scenario and fails to consider new technology and other actions that could reduce carbon emissions and the effects of climate change. I'm Alice Bryant.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Health and Lifestyle Report. Most of us know that physical activity leads to better health. That is nothing new. But for the first time in 10 years, the United States government has changed its guidance on how much exercise people need to stay healthy and when they should start. Dr. Brett Giroir is Assistant Secretary for Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In a video, he spoke with the Associated Press about the new guidelines. Dr. Giroir says he is excited about the new guidelines. He adds that getting or attaining the health benefits from exercise may be easier than earlier thought.
I'm very excited about the guidelines because what we have found out is that It's actually easier to attain the health benefits than we thought before, and the health benefits are so much greater.
That is good news for people in the U.S. who may need to lose weight. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that in 2016, about 93 million adults nationwide were overweight or considered obese. Its website notes that obesity rates for both adults and children have been rising since 1999. The new federal guidance states that children as young as 3 years old need to be physically active. Earlier guidelines used to begin at age 6. Dr. Gerard says that the most important time for children to begin exercising is between the ages of 3 and 5. He notes that boys and girls in this age group need at least 3 hours of activity every day.
That was not present in our previous guidelines, but essentially those recommendations are that children in the 3 to 5 year old age group really require about 3 hours of activities per day. That could be light activities, moderate activities, or even vigorous activities. This is the kind of play that children normally engage in.
Doctors say it is important to start young. They add that from birth to age 5, a child's brain develops more than at any other time in life. These developments have a lasting effect on a child's ability to learn and to succeed in school and in life. Also, Gerard says that children who start exercising at a young age are more likely to establish healthy behaviors that will continue into adulthood. Dr. Gerard does not suggest putting your 5-year-old on a treadmill or other exercise equipment. He said simply giving a child the time and space to play actively, as they normally would, is enough. The new guidelines say that children ages 6 through 17 get at least 1 hour of moderate to vigorous activity a day. Most of this activity should be aerobic exercise, such as biking, swimming, or running. Aerobic activity can strengthen the heart and lungs by making them work hard for several minutes or more. Exercise should also include muscle and bone-strengthening activities, such as climbing trees or playground equipment, and playing sports. Experts suggest that children get this kind of exercise at least 3 times a week. For adults, the suggested length of time for exercise remains the same.
So for adults, the guidelines recommend 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. That could be brisk walking, it could be mowing the lawn, it could be gardening, it could be dancing, any kind of activity that gets your heart rate up and gets you exercising moderately.
The federal government has changed its guidance for the amount of aerobic exercise adults should have. Earlier guidelines stated that aerobic activity is only effective if it lasts for at least 10 minutes. Experts now say that even short amounts of aerobics can help. It can provide short-term health benefits, such as lowering blood pressure, reducing anxiety, and improving sleep. They also think adults need at least 2 days of muscle-strengthening exercise, like push-ups or lifting weights. The advice for older adults remains mostly unchanged from earlier federal guidelines. However, those over age 65 should include activities that help aid balance and flexibility. Better balance means fewer falls and less chance of injury. The new guidelines have changed nothing about the dangers of sitting too much. It is especially harmful and can even undo the benefits of exercise you may have gained. And that's the Health and Lifestyle Report. I'm Anna Mateo.
From VOA Learning English, this is The Making of a Nation, American History in Special English. I'm Steve Ember. We begin the story of a document that defined a nation, the United States Constitution. The 13 American colonies declared their independence from Britain in 1776. But they had to fight for that independence in a long war that followed. During that war, the states were united by an agreement called the Articles of Confederation. But the Union of 13 states was loosely organized. The Articles of Confederation created a weak central government. The document did not create courts or provide for a president or other executive to carry out laws. The Articles of Confederation did create a Congress, but that legislature had little power or money. When British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia, a messenger brought the news to the Congress. But Congress could not even pay the messenger, so money had to be collected from each member. The war ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Even before then, 3 influential Americans had called for a change in this loose confederation of states. The 3 were George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. They urged the formation of a strong central government. George Washington commanded America's troops during the Revolution. He opposed the Articles of Confederation because they provided little support for his army. His soldiers struggled with shortages of food, warm clothing, shoes, and other supplies. Here is an actor playing George Washington in a show at the National Archives. He is talking about the Articles of Confederation.
In my mind, it prolonged the war by several years. Every time I needed men or money to prosecute the war, I had to go to 13 sovereign heads of state, hat in hand. Even now, under peacetime conditions, we are like a giant with 13 heads tottering towards a cliff.
Alexander Hamilton was a young lawyer who served as an aide to General Washington during the Revolution. Hamilton called for a convention of the 13 states to create a new central government. He expressed his opinion in letters, speeches, and newspaper articles. Finally, there was James Madison. He was one of the authors of the state constitution in Virginia in 1776. When Madison, Hamilton, and Washington looked at the Articles of Confederation, they saw an unhappy picture. There were 13 governments that each tried to help themselves at the expense of the others. Each state had its own army. 9 states had their own navy. The states had these forces to protect themselves from each other. For example, Virginia passed a law which said it could seize ships that did not pay taxes to the state. Virginia did not mean ships from Great Britain or Spain. It meant ships from other states, like Maryland and Pennsylvania.
Basically, the thought was, we need a military defense structure, we need a modest army and a navy, we need to regulate trade with Europe, and individual states in a loose confederation won't do the job.
Akil Reed Amar is a professor at Yale Law School. He says Americans realized a strong central government could improve their national security system. In 1786, representatives from Maryland and Virginia met to discuss opening land for new settlements along the Potomac River. The Potomac formed the border between those two states. The representatives agreed that the issue of settling new land was too big for just two states to decide. Someone asked, why not invite Delaware and Pennsylvania to help? Someone else said all the states should be invited. Then they could discuss all the problems that were giving the new nation so much trouble. The idea was accepted, and a convention was set for Annapolis, Maryland. The convention opened as planned, but it was not much of a meeting. Representatives came from only 5 states. The men who did meet at Annapolis, however, agreed that it was a beginning. They agreed, too, that a larger convention should be called. They appointed the representative from New York, Alexander Hamilton, to put the agreement in writing. So Hamilton sent a message to the legislature of each state. He called for a convention in Philadelphia in May of the next year, 1787. The purpose of the convention, he said, would be to write a constitution for the United States. The nation was new, but the idea of a constitution was not. Law professor Akil Reed Amar explains that the earliest settlers had formed political agreements called compacts, charters, or corporations. These agreements developed into state constitutions.
And then in 1787-88, the idea becomes to try to continentalize, to take on a much bigger scale this idea of a written constitution, setting forth the rules for how people would govern themselves, what government could do and not do, what their powers would be, and what the limits would be.
Even so, he says, Americans were not sure about creating such a constitution. Amar says they were afraid a new central government might be as arrogant and out of touch as the King of England had been. However, most people slowly came to believe that a strong central government would protect their country better than the loose union of 13 states could. Many people also believed that a constitutional convention would not succeed without George Washington. People wanted to elect him president of the convention, but Washington did not want to go. He suffered from rheumatism. His mother and sister were sick. He needed to take care of business at Mount Vernon, his farm in Virginia. And he already said he was not interested in public office. George Washington was the most famous man in America. Suppose only a few states sent representatives to the convention. Suppose it failed. Would he look foolish? Two close friends, James Madison and Edmund Randolph, urged George Washington to go to Philadelphia. He trusted them, so he said he would go as one of the representatives of Virginia. From that moment, it was clear the convention would be an important event. If George Washington would be there, it had to be important. The first delegate to arrive in Philadelphia for the convention was James Madison. Madison was 35 years old. He was short and losing his hair. He was not a good speaker, but he always knew what he wanted to say. He had read everything that had been published in English about governments, from the governments of ancient Greece to those of his own time. Madison believed the United States needed a strong central government that was more powerful than the 13 states. Madison also knew that he should not push his ideas too quickly, so he planned his work quietly. He came to the convention with hundreds of books and papers. He was prepared to answer any question about government that any other representative might ask him. Madison asked the other delegates from Virginia to also arrive early. He wanted to enter the convention with a plan for a strong central government. He was sure no other state would do this. 2 Virginia delegates came early as requested. Together, the 3 men worked on Madison's plan. The only other delegates there were from Pennsylvania. Nobody seemed worried that there were no delegates from the other 11 states. After all, it took 2 weeks to ride a horse to Philadelphia from New Hampshire in the Northeast, and it took as long as 3 weeks to get to Philadelphia from Georgia in the South. Finally, the other delegates started coming, a few at a time. 55 men in all from 12 states. Pennsylvania sent the most delegates, 8. Rhode Island sent none. A few of the delegates were very old, but many were in their 20s or 30s. The average age of the delegates was just 43 years. From the moment the convention began, Madison kept careful records of everything everyone said. He never stopped writing. If it were not for James Madison, we would know little of what happened at that historic meeting in Philadelphia in 1787. Later, Madison explained how he did it. He wrote, "I sat in front of the president of the convention. All the other delegates were on my right and on my left. I could hear everything the president said. I could hear all the words of every delegate. I made notes only I could understand. Then, at night in my room, I wrote out completely all the speeches and acts. I attended the convention every day. I was there as long as the delegates were meeting and talking." James Madison's full records of the convention were not published until 30 years later.
And that's our program for today. Listen again tomorrow to learn English through stories from around the world. I'm Jonathan Evans.
And I'm Ashley Thompson.